This is true crime stories for sleep. The narrow streets of South Boston, known to locals simply as Southie, were a world unto themselves. Rows of three-decker houses clung to the edge of the city, their porches filled with Irish families whose lives revolved around the church, the Union Hall, and the neighborhood bar. In the 1930s, the smell of coal smoke and salt air hung thick over the harbor, and the sounds of trolley bells and ship horns echoed through the streets. This was the kind of neighborhood that demanded toughness, loyalty, and silence. To survive here, you didn't just grow up, you hardened. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support keeps these true stories of America's most notorious figures alive. Now, let's head back to where it all began. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born on September 3, 1929, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, but it was South Boston that would define him. He was the second of 6 children born to James, Big Jim, Bulger Sr., a longshoreman who had lost his arm in an accident at the docks, and Jane McCarthy Bulger, a devoted mother who raised her children with strict Catholic discipline. The Bulgers were poor, like most of their neighbors, and their tenement sat among the maze of row houses that sprawled toward the harbor. The Great Depression hit Southie hard. Work was scarce, tempers short, and pride easily wounded. But it was also a community fiercely proud of its Irish roots. In those years, Southie Irish meant something, a badge of survival, defiance, and belonging in a city where class and heritage still divided the neighborhoods. From a young age, Jimmy Bulger stood out. He was wiry, blue-eyed, and quick with his fists. Teachers remembered him as bright but restless, always testing limits, always watching. He wasn't content to follow the rules of others. He made his own. When most kids were shining shoes or running errands for pocket change, Jimmy ran with older boys who knew the back alleys better than the schoolyard. It was in those alleys that he first learned how power worked, not from textbooks, but from the streets. The men who held power weren't the ones with the best jobs or the most money. They were the ones who inspired fear. By his early teens, Jimmy had fallen in with a local gang of boys called the Shamrocks. They weren't organized criminals, not yet, but they ran petty schemes, stealing from delivery trucks, reselling cigarettes, shaking down smaller kids for cash. Southie cops knew them by name, and when a burglary or brawl broke out, Bulger was often somewhere nearby. He earned his nickname around this time, Whitey. It started as a teasing reference to his blonde hair, but he despised it. He preferred being called Jim, or Jimmy, but Whitey stuck, echoing off brick walls and police blotters alike. Years later, he'd threaten anyone who used it to his face. Southie wasn't just a tough neighborhood, it was a divided one. Beneath the unity of its Irish identity, it simmered with tension. Political power was controlled by ward bosses and local toughs. Loyalty to family, parish, and block came before loyalty to law. The Bulgers were well known, and while Big Jim was respected for his union work, the family's reputation would soon rest on his son's shoulders, for better or worse. At the same time, another Bulger boy was growing up very differently. Billy Bulger, Whitey's younger brother, was quiet, bookish, and ambitious. Where Jimmy skipped school, Billy excelled, guided by teachers who saw his sharp mind and persuasive charm. He would one day rise to become the president of the Massachusetts Senate, the most powerful political figure in the state. But in these early years, their paths diverged sharply, one brother aiming for the State House, the other destined for the underworld. As Jimmy's teenage years unfolded, so did his taste for risk. He and his gang started stealing cars, knocking over small stores, and robbing delivery trucks. South Boston police knew his name well by 1942. But even as he grew bolder, he was cunning enough to avoid long sentences. He talked fast, kept quiet about his friends, and always seemed one step ahead. The war changed everything. With America's entry into World War II, South Boston's docks came alive again, ships loading for Europe, factories buzzing. Patriotism ran high, and young men were expected to serve. At 16, Jimmy tried to enlist in the U.S. Navy, lying about his age. The recruiters caught on and sent him home, but the seed was planted. When he turned 18, he tried again, and this time, he made it. The Navy offered escape, a chance to leave Southey, to prove himself beyond the narrow streets that had both shaped and confined him. But discipline was never his strength. He shipped out in 1943, and for a while, the sea seemed to suit him. He learned structure, command, and strategy. Yet he also got into fights, defied officers, and pushed boundaries. His temper flared at the smallest provocation. There were reports of assaults, unauthorized absences, and near mutinies. He served aboard the USS Leyte, a light aircraft carrier, where the rigid order of military life clashed with his instinct for independence. He could be charming and loyal to those he liked, but ruthless toward those he didn't. Fellow sailors remembered him as sharp, unpredictable, and utterly fearless. The Navy eventually had enough. After multiple disciplinary actions, Jimmy was dishonorably discharged in 1946. He came home to South Boston a different man, angrier, sharper, more self-assured. He had seen the world beyond the docks, but he didn't come back humbled. He came back with a new edge and a sense of destiny. By now, the streets of Southey had changed. The war brought prosperity, but not for everyone. Organized crime was taking root. Bookmakers, loan sharks, and protection rackets run by small-time Irish hoods under the shadow of the Italian mafia to the north. Young men who once fought over turf now fought over territory that could be monetized. Jimmy saw opportunity. He'd learned how to navigate hierarchies, read people, and mask his emotions. The Navy had failed to tame him, but it had trained him to watch, wait, and strike at the right moment. In these years, Southey became a world of contradictions. On one hand, it was the picture of Irish-American pride, parades, church picnics, and tight family bonds. On the other, it was a breeding ground for corruption, violence, and silence. "Don't talk to cops" wasn't just a saying, it was law. And in that silence, men like Whitey Bulger thrived. He began associating with tougher criminals, men who robbed payroll trucks, hijacked goods, and made quick fortunes off black market sales. His name started appearing in police files for armed robbery and assault. Though not yet a major player, he was becoming known as someone who could keep his mouth shut and do what needed to be done. One night, during a small-time robbery that went sideways, a store clerk recognized him and tried to grab a shotgun. Bulger moved faster, striking first, disarming the man before fleeing with the cash. It wasn't the money that thrilled him, it was the control. The power of watching fear flicker across someone's eyes. He wasn't a seasoned mobster yet, but the hunger was there. And so was the coldness that would one day define him. Meanwhile, the world around him was shifting. Boston's underworld was a labyrinth of gangs, alliances, and ethnic rivalries. The Irish controlled South Boston, Charlestown, and parts of Dorchester, while the Italians, especially the Patriarca crime family, held the North End. It was only a matter of time before these worlds collided. But before Whitey could rise to power, he would first have to fall. His early crimes caught up with him by the late 1940s. When federal agents finally came knocking, they found not a scared kid from Southey, but a hardened young man with a calm stare and an unflinching resolve. As they led him away in handcuffs, one detective noted, "He didn't blink once. Not once." Whitey Bulger was just getting started. The war had ended, and America was roaring back to life. In the neighborhoods of Boston, returning soldiers filled the bars, the factories were busy again, and the air hummed with a new optimism. But for James, Whitey Bulger, home from the Navy with a dishonorable discharge and a growing reputation for trouble, optimism wasn't part of the plan. Southey might have been full of hope, but he wasn't built for steady work or quiet living. He was restless, an outsider even in his own streets, and his hunger for power was starting to find direction. He'd been gone long enough for the old faces to fade and the new gangs to rise. The Shamrocks, the scrappy street crew he'd once run with, were now scattered or serving time. The older Irish hoods, the ones who ran the rackets in Southey, didn't trust him yet. But Whitey wasn't the kind to wait for trust. He started small, moving through the shadows of Boston's underbelly, where gambling dens, truck yards, and waterfront bars formed the arteries of a city pulsing with opportunity. He wasn't making much money, but he was learning. He watched how the small-time bookmakers handled debts, how the muscle worked a room, and how information moved faster than cash. Every conversation, every fight, every payoff was a lesson. Southie wasn't run by the smartest men, it was run by the ones who understood fear. Whitey understood that better than anyone. At night, he drifted between the docks and the pool halls, dealing in small hustles, stolen cigarettes, hot radios, the occasional car theft. To some, he was just another tough kid from the neighborhood. But those who got close enough saw something colder in him. He didn't get drunk like the others. He didn't brag about his fights. He waited, he listened, and when he spoke, it was always with intent. By the mid-1940s, the Boston underworld was in transition. The Irish gangs controlled Southie and Charlestown, but the Italian mafia, the Patriarca family from Providence, was expanding its reach northward. The city was on the brink of a turf war, though no one knew it yet. For young men like Bulger, this chaos was a ladder, and he meant to climb it. It started with truck hijackings. Whitey and a few other Southie boys began targeting delivery trucks along the outskirts of Boston, taking whatever they could fence: textiles, appliances, liquor. The goods moved fast, and the money was better than anything he could have earned honestly. But it wasn't just the cash that thrilled him. It was the precision. He ran each job like a small military operation, timed, efficient, and ruthless. He learned early that violence was most effective when used sparingly and decisively. One night, when a truck driver tried to play hero and reach for a wrench, Bulger pistol-whipped him without hesitation. The man went down hard, and the message was clear. From then on, no one interfered. By 1948, Bulger's name was circulating among law enforcement. The Boston Police Department had a file on him. The FBI, not yet the powerful machine it would become, noted him as a local suspect in multiple theft operations. Still, he stayed ahead of them. He moved carefully, avoided patterns, and never boasted. But the ambition that kept him alive was also pushing him toward greater risks. By 1950, he was no longer satisfied with hijackings and street rackets. He wanted bigger scores, jobs that required planning, nerve, and precision. The kind that could make a man rich overnight. That opportunity came in 1955, when Bulger joined a small crew planning a bank robbery in Rhode Island. The target was modest, a local branch that handled payrolls for nearby factories, but the plan was daring. Dressed as construction workers, they cased the bank for weeks, learning the routines, the deliveries, the guards' habits. On the morning of the robbery, Bulger's crew entered just after opening. The tellers barely had time to react before the men were shouting, guns raised, voices calm but commanding. They took the cash, just over $50,000, a fortune at the time, and vanished within minutes. No one was hurt. It was clean, fast, and efficient. For a moment, Whitey Bulger believed he'd pulled off perfection. But perfection doesn't last. 2 months later, one of the crew members was picked up on an unrelated charge. Under pressure, he talked. The FBI followed the trail straight back to Boston, and to James, Whitey Bulger. The arrest was quiet. Federal agents waited outside a bar on West Broadway, where Bulger was known to spend his evenings. When he stepped out into the cold night air, they were already there, badges out, guns ready. He didn't resist. He just smiled faintly and said, "You boys took your time." In 1956, he was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He was 26 years old. The cell door closed on him at Atlanta Penitentiary, one of the toughest federal prisons in the country. Inside, he encountered a new world, a brutal, hierarchical system where violence and control ruled everything. The air smelled of sweat and metal, and the corridors rang with the sounds of men who'd given up on freedom long ago. Bulger didn't give up. He adapted. He quickly learned the prison code: don't talk, don't show fear, and don't get attached. He kept his head down, watched the guards, and studied the system. Every rule was a weapon, every weakness a target. He earned a reputation for being calm under pressure, capable of handling himself in fights, but never reckless. Even then, he wasn't driven by impulse, he was driven by calculation. Still, even calculation couldn't protect him from the system's brutality. Prison life was a daily test of endurance, violent, dehumanizing, and suffocating. When a guard humiliated another inmate during a shakedown, Bulger stood silently in the corner, watching. Later that night, when the opportunity came, the guard found his tires slashed in the parking lot. No one ever proved who did it, but words spread fast: "Don't push the kid from Southie too far." After several years in Atlanta, Bulger was transferred to Leavenworth in Kansas, a colder, stricter institution where he became increasingly introspective. He read philosophy, studied criminal history, and honed his understanding of power. He wasn't reforming. He was refining. Then came the transfer that would mark him forever: Alcatraz. In 1959, Bulger was moved to the island prison that loomed over San Francisco Bay, the infamous Rock. Surrounded by cold water and fog, Alcatraz was the end of the line. Only the most incorrigible, dangerous, or escape-prone inmates were sent there. To survive Alcatraz, you needed discipline and control. Bulger had both. He adapted to the routine, the endless counts, the silence, the isolation. Other inmates cracked under the pressure, but he thrived in it. The solitude hardened him, stripped away emotion, and left behind something colder, more focused. Years later, Bulger would claim that during his time in federal custody, he was part of a government experiment, MKUltra, the CIA's secret program testing LSD on inmates. He said he volunteered, thinking it would shorten his sentence. Instead, he was subjected to hallucinogenic doses, locked in isolation, and left to spiral through terror and madness. Whether every detail of his account was true remains debated, but one thing was certain: prison changed him irrevocably. When he was finally released in 1965, after 9 long years behind bars, Whitey Bulger was no longer the brash Southie kid who'd robbed trucks and fought over corners. He was 35 years old, quiet, patient, and unreadable. The rage was still there, but buried deep under layers of control. He returned to Boston a man transformed, and yet, in Southie, little had changed. The faces were older, the bars the same, the air still thick with smoke and secrets. But the underworld he'd once known had evolved. The Italian mafia now dominated the city's rackets, and the Irish gangs that remained were fractured and desperate. For Whitey Bulger, that wasn't discouragement. It was opportunity. He'd spent a decade studying the anatomy of power from inside the system. Now, he was ready to build his own empire, one built not just on violence, but on fear, silence, and strategy. The boy from South Boston was coming home, and the city had no idea what was about to hit it. The ferry ride across the San Francisco Bay was a one-way trip few ever forgot. Ahead, rising from the fog and the gray-green water, sat Alcatraz Island, a fortress of concrete and steel perched on jagged rock. For those sent there, it wasn't just another prison. It was the end of the line. The gates of hell in uniform gray. When James, Whitey, Bulger arrived in 1959, the island was home to some of the most dangerous men in America. Bank robbers, killers, escape artists, each locked away from the world in a place designed to break them. Alcatraz wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about containment. Once you walked through those gates, you disappeared from the world. The journey had begun years earlier, when Whitey's string of armed robberies finally caught up with him. He'd already done time in Atlanta and Leavenworth, but both institutions had struggled to contain him. He was defiant but controlled, obedient on paper but quietly manipulative. The Bureau of Prisons saw a man who couldn't be tamed, one too smart and too stubborn for ordinary confinement. So they sent him to the Rock. The ferry cut through the fog that morning, the sound of gulls echoing overhead. Whitey stood at the rail, wrists shackled, the sea spray cold against his face. The island grew larger with every wave, its watchtowers and razor wire glinting in the weak sunlight. Somewhere deep inside him, he felt a flicker of curiosity. This was where America sent its worst, and he was now one of them. When he stepped off the boat, guards led him through the sally port, past rows of armed men and barking orders. The air smelled of bleach, salt, and iron. Prisoners marched in silence, eyes forward, every sound amplified in the hollow concrete halls. He was processed, stripped, deloused, and handed his uniform, gray trousers, denim shirt, and a number that would replace his name, AZ 1428. For a man like Whitey Bulger, whose pride and defiance had defined him since childhood, the ritual of surrender was poison. But he didn't show it. He understood that survival here required restraint. Alcatraz broke loud men first. The quiet ones endured. His cell was small, 6 by 9 feet, with a cot, a metal sink, and a single shelf. The walls were painted a dull green that reflected no light. From his cell window, if he stood just right, he could see a slice of the San Francisco skyline. Freedom, taunting him from across the bay. The routine was relentless. Lights on at 6:30 a.m., roll call, breakfast in silence, work assignments in the laundry or workshops, dinner, and lockdown by 9:30 p.m. Every movement, every breath, regulated. There was no privacy, no conversation without permission. The rules were the law. But Whitey had never been a man to break rules out of impulse. He broke them when it served him. So, he played the model inmate. He followed orders, spoke little, and kept to himself. Guards noted his composure, his discipline, his intelligence. In a place filled with rage and despair, Bulger's control made him stand out. Still, Alcatraz was no sanctuary. Violence lurked behind every shadow. Fights broke out in the showers, knives appeared from nowhere, and every inmate carried grudges like ghosts. Whitey knew how to read danger. He avoided the alliances that consumed weaker men. He wasn't interested in loyalty. He was interested in power and information. He learned who controlled the contraband, who bribed guards, who had outside connections. He traded favors carefully, never owing anyone, never making promises he couldn't keep. His ability to navigate the unspoken politics of prison life was uncanny. Even among killers and gangsters, he exuded quiet authority. But Alcatraz didn't just shape him physically, it changed him psychologically. The isolation carved into him a coldness that would define the rest of his life. When you spend years surrounded by concrete and silence, empathy became a liability. During his early years there, an event occurred that Bulger would later claim altered his mind permanently: his alleged participation in a CIA-sponsored LSD experiment under the MKUltra program. The program was real, an operation designed to study mind control, fear, and behavior modification through hallucinogenic drugs. The CIA recruited prison doctors to administer tests on inmates, often under the guise of medical research. Whitey later said he volunteered, believing it would shorten his sentence. Instead, he became a test subject. He would describe being injected with LSD and confined for hours, hallucinating in a locked cell with no contact, no sense of time, no anchor to reality. The walls pulsed, voices whispered, and shadows crawled. The experiments left him paranoid, sleepless, and filled with recurring nightmares. Whether his recollections were fully accurate or not, one truth stood: he left Alcatraz colder than he entered it. The world had been stripped of color, replaced by calculation. He understood now that institutions, whether prisons or governments, weren't about justice. They were about control. By the early 1960s, cracks began to form in the prison's image of invincibility. Escape attempts increased, morale among guards declined, and the cost of running the island soared. Inmates whispered about famous breakouts: Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in 1962, whose fate remained a mystery. Whitey heard the rumors and quietly admired the audacity. He didn't believe in pointless rebellion, but he respected the will to challenge authority. His time in Alcatraz taught him something profound: violence wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The threat of fear could be more powerful than the act itself. Watching weaker men unravel, he began to see manipulation as a weapon sharper than any blade. In 1963, After nearly 4 years on the island, he was transferred back to Leavenworth to serve the remainder of his sentence. Alcatraz was preparing to close. The government deemed it too costly, too broken. For Bulger, the transfer wasn't a release, it was a reminder. He'd survived the worst. Everything after this would be manageable. Back at Leavenworth, he was different. Inmates noticed the distance in his eyes, the way he seemed detached from emotion. He read constantly: psychology, politics, military history. He admired figures who used power strategically: Caesar, Napoleon, and Machiavelli. Books became his roadmap. They taught him that control wasn't about brute force, it was about perception. He developed a new kind of patience. He stopped reacting to provocations. When another inmate tried to start a fight, Bulger didn't rise to it. He simply stared, unblinking, until the man backed down. The reputation followed him everywhere. Prison officials, noting his excellent conduct, began to consider early release. His transformation from violent offender to compliant inmate was convincing on paper. But beneath that calm exterior, Whitey was plotting. He had no intention of returning to the small-time rackets of his youth. He wanted more. Finally, in 1965, after 9 years behind bars, Whitey Bulger walked free. The gates opened to a different America, one caught between post-war optimism and the social unrest of the coming decade. Cities were changing, old hierarchies crumbling. And in Boston, the underworld was ripe for the taking. He returned to South Boston to find the same narrow streets, the same smoky bars, but an entirely new criminal order. The Italian mafia, led by Raymond Patriarca out of Providence, now dominated organized crime across New England. The Irish hoods who once ruled Southie were either in prison or dead. Whitey took it all in: the shifting alliances, the power gaps, the sense of inevitability. He didn't rush. He reconnected quietly, visiting old friends, old haunts, gauging the pulse of the streets. People still remembered him, the young rebel who'd gone away for years and returned with something dangerous in his eyes. He wasn't loud about his ambitions, but he made one thing clear: South Boston would not belong to outsiders. Not the Italians, not the cops, not anyone. At night, he'd walk the waterfront, the cold wind blowing off the harbor, and look toward the glowing skyline. The city had grown, but the rules hadn't changed. Power still belonged to those willing to take it. The boy who'd once stolen from delivery trucks had become a man forged by isolation, sharpened by intelligence, and unburdened by conscience. He'd learned patience. He'd learned control. And now, he was ready to learn domination. Boston didn't know it yet, but Whitey Bulger was coming home to rule. When James, Whitey, Bulger stepped back onto the streets of South Boston in 1965, the city had changed, but not as much as it pretended to. The faces were older, the bars louder, and the skyline taller, but underneath it all, the same currents of loyalty, fear, and violence still flowed through the neighborhoods like an underground river. And Whitey could feel it the moment his shoes hit the cracked pavement. For most men, 9 years behind bars, 4 of them spent inside Alcatraz, would have burned away the fire that once lived in them. But not Whitey. The time hadn't tamed him, it had tempered him. What emerged from prison wasn't a lost soul looking for redemption. It was a strategist, a man who had learned that real power didn't come from brute force, but from control. South Boston, or Southie, was still the same proud, tight-knit Irish enclave he'd left behind. It was a place where everyone knew your mother, where your last name carried more weight than your reputation, and where outsiders, especially Italians from the North End, weren't welcome. But while Southie remained defiant, the power that once defined its underworld had shifted. In Whitey's absence, the Italian mafia, under Raymond Patriarca, had consolidated its influence across New England. From Providence to Boston, Patriarca's men controlled the bookies, the loan sharks, and the unions. The old Irish gangs had faded, splintered by arrests, betrayals, and infighting. What remained of their control existed in small, violent pockets. At the center of that chaos was Donald Killeen, a bulky, quick-tempered Southie gangster who ran gambling and loans out of a few bars near the waterfront. The Killeen brothers, Donald, Eddie, and George, had been small-time players when Whitey went away, but now they were trying to hold back a younger, hungrier group led by the Mullen Gang, run by Polly McGonigal and Patrick Ney. The tension between the two sides was boiling, and it was about to spill into a full-fledged war. Whitey didn't rush to pick a side. He knew better than to jump into a fight he didn't control. For months after his release, he kept a low profile, working odd jobs, running small hustles, and spending nights in the bars listening more than talking. He was rebuilding his network, one handshake at a time. But it didn't take long for word to spread that Whitey Bulger was back. And in Southie, that name still carried weight. To the older generation, he was a neighborhood legend, the tough kid who'd taken on the system and survived Alcatraz. To the younger ones, he was an almost mythical figure, a ghost from another era. Donald Killeen took notice. He needed soldiers, men who could intimidate and command respect. Whitey, with his cold intelligence and ruthless precision, fit the bill perfectly. By 1968, Bulger was working under Killeen, running collections and enforcing debts. Killeen liked him because he didn't talk much and didn't need supervision. Whitey liked Killeen because he was reckless and predictable, a man whose ego would eventually get him killed. The Killeen-Mullen feud was escalating fast. Bars were being firebombed, cars rigged with explosives, and bodies dumped in alleys. The violence wasn't about money anymore, it was about pride, about who controlled Southie's soul. Whitey watched it unfold with the same calm he'd shown in prison. He didn't shoot first. He waited, calculated, and positioned himself. In the chaos, he found opportunity. Then, in May of 1972, everything changed. Donald Killeen walked out of his home one morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and started his car. The moment he turned the ignition, a bullet tore through his head. The murder sent shockwaves through South Boston. No one needed to guess who had done it. The Mullen Gang had finally made their move. But while the neighborhood mourned, Whitey was already several steps ahead. He didn't waste time seeking revenge or hiding. Instead, he approached the one man who could make peace between the two factions, Howie Winter, leader of the Winter Hill Gang from Somerville. Winter was sharp, connected, and calculating. He controlled a large slice of Boston's criminal operations and had the rare ability to manage chaos. Whitey saw in him something he respected, a businessman who understood that survival in the underworld required more than bullets. Through Winter's mediation, the Mullen and Killeen remnants brokered a truce. But Whitey didn't just survive the war, he emerged stronger. The Killeens were gone, and the Mullens saw value in keeping Bulger close. He wasn't a hot-headed killer like so many others. He was a thinker, a man who could command loyalty and fear in equal measure. Under Winter's umbrella, Bulger became part of the Winter Hill Gang, a coalition that operated across Boston, Somerville, and Charlestown. It was a mix of Irish and non-Italian criminals who worked around the mafia's influence but paid tribute when necessary. The arrangement was delicate but effective. Whitey thrived in it. He handled gambling, loans, and protection rackets, using violence strategically, not impulsively. His rule was simple: intimidate, but don't overexpose. Be feared, not hunted. To the people of South Boston, he wasn't just another thug. He was one of them, an Irish son of the neighborhood who protected locals from outsiders. He paid for kids' Christmas gifts, handed out cash to families in need, and bought rounds at bars. People started calling him Robin Hood, though the truth was far darker. Behind that image, Whitey was consolidating absolute control. He studied how the mafia structured its hierarchy, how they used fear, silence, and loyalty as currency. But unlike them, he had an advantage. The people of Southie trusted him. They saw him as their defender against Italian dominance and police intrusion. By the early 1970s, Whitey was untouchable in South Boston. His operations ran like clockwork. He demanded silence from everyone involved, no bragging, no loose talk. Those who disobeyed disappeared. Rumors spread about men who'd crossed him and were never seen again. Whether all of them were true didn't matter, the fear worked. But Whitey wasn't satisfied with street-level power. He'd seen enough from inside prison to understand how the real system worked. It wasn't about who had the biggest gun, it was about who had protection. And protection, in Boston, came from the FBI. Around this time, a young FBI agent named John Connolly was making his way up the ranks. Like Bulger, he was from Southie, same neighborhood, same streets, even the same childhood church. Connolly idolized Whitey growing up. Now, with the Bureau's focus on dismantling the Italian mafia, he saw an opportunity. Connolly approached Bulger with a proposition: information for immunity. The FBI wanted Patriarca's mafia more than they wanted local Irish thugs. If Whitey could feed them intelligence on Italian operations, the Bureau would look the other way on his. It was the perfect deal, on paper. But for Whitey, it was more than survival. It was power. It meant he could eliminate rivals and operate freely, all under the protection of federal law enforcement. By the time 1975 arrived, Whitey Bulger had transformed himself from a small-time stick-up man into the most feared, and most protected, criminal in Boston. His network extended through bars, bookmakers, union halls, and even police precincts. His enemies either joined him or vanished. His partnership with Connolly gave him eyes inside the FBI itself, turning the hunters into his unwitting accomplices. He no longer needed to hide his ambition. South Boston wasn't enough anymore. He was thinking bigger: Somerville, Charlestown, Quincy, even the North End. The old Irish gangs that once ruled in pieces were now united under his quiet command. At night, he'd sit in his car overlooking the city from Castle Island, cigarette smoke curling through the air, the harbor lights reflecting in his eyes. He had come from nothing, from the projects, from Alcatraz, from the bottom rung of the underworld, and now he was the king of South Boston. But kings, especially criminal ones, only ruled as long as fear lasted. And Whitey knew better than anyone fear was fragile. One whisper, one betrayal, could shatter it all. Still, for now, his throne was secure. The city belonged to him. The FBI was his shield. And the legend of Whitey Bulger, the ghost of South Boston, was only just beginning. By the mid-1970s, the streets of Boston belonged to two kinds of men: those who feared Whitey Bulger, and those who owed him. His rise had been methodical, patient, and brutally efficient. He was no longer the street enforcer lurking in Southie's bars. He was now the quiet force behind nearly every dollar that moved through its back alleys. But what most didn't know, what even his closest associates couldn't have imagined, was that Whitey Bulger had made the kind of deal that only devils and tacticians make. He was now an informant for the FBI. It started small, almost unspoken. The connection came through Agent John Connolly, the Southie kid who'd grown up idolizing Whitey and now wore the Bureau's badge with pride. Connolly had joined the Boston Field Office's organized crime squad, and his orders were clear: dismantle the Italian mafia, the Patriarca crime family, and reclaim Boston's streets for law and order. But Connolly knew the streets didn't run on laws, they ran on leverage. And in Southie, no one held more leverage than Whitey. In the spring of 1975, Connolly arranged a private meeting between Bulger and FBI supervisor John Morris. It was held in a quiet apartment in Quincy, away from curious eyes and recording devices. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, the blinds drawn tight. Connolly made the introduction, half formal, half conspiratorial. "Jimmy," he said, his tone mixing admiration and caution, "the Bureau's interested in hearing what you know about the Italians. You help us clean up their mess, we make sure you don't get dragged into it." Whitey didn't answer right away. He watched Morris, read his face, measured his words. Then, in that low Southie drawl, he said, "You want information, I'll give you information. But I'm no rat. You don't ever call me that. I'm helping you because I hate them, understand?" That distinction mattered to Whitey. To him, being an informant wasn't betrayal, it was strategy. Rats snitched for survival. He was negotiating for dominance. The arrangement was simple. Whitey would feed the FBI intelligence on mafia operations, and in return, the Bureau would look the other way on his activities. They called it top echelon informant status. What it meant, in reality, was immunity. From that moment on, Whitey Bulger became both predator and protected. He began supplying Connolly and Morris with everything they wanted: details on mafia meetings, gambling routes, money drops, and union payoffs. Most of it was true, some of it exaggerated, but all of it valuable. The Bureau saw results almost immediately. Arrests followed, indictments piled up, and headlines praised the FBI's progress in crippling the Patriarca family. Behind the scenes, though, Whitey used his new position to wipe out his competition. Every time a rival crew caught the Bureau's attention, Connolly would quietly tip off Bulger, giving him time to move, hide, or strike first. The FBI believed they were cleaning the city. In truth, they were clearing the board for Whitey. His partnership with the Bureau became one of the most effective criminal shields in modern history. When police raids targeted bookies, Bulger's operations were mysteriously spared. When names surfaced in investigations, his disappeared. His enemies were arrested or found dead, and his business grew untouched. In the bars and backrooms of South Boston, whispers began to spread. How was Whitey avoiding heat when everyone else was getting pinched? Some suspected he had friends in high places. None dared to say it aloud. To accuse him of being an informant was to sign your own death warrant. Bulger, meanwhile, refined his empire. The Winter Hill Gang, under Howie Winter, still operated as a loose alliance of racketeers and loan sharks. But Bulger had outgrown it. He didn't want to be another lieutenant in someone else's operation. He wanted to rule. So, he waited for his chance. In 1979, that chance came. Howie Winter and several of his top men were indicted on horse racing fixing charges, the result of a massive federal investigation. The bust crippled the gang's leadership, leaving a vacuum no one was strong enough to fill. No one except Whitey Bulger. He moved quickly, quietly, assuming control of Winter Hill's gambling, loan sharking, and extortion rackets. Most of the crew accepted it without question. Those who didn't last. By 1980, the Winter Hill Gang was no longer Winter's. It was Bulger's. From his base in South Boston, Whitey began running his operations like a corporation. He diversified his income streams: illegal gambling, drug distribution, protection rackets, and high-interest loans. Every dollar that moved through Southie passed through his hands. He took his cut, and in exchange offered protection from violence or police interference. To the residents of South Boston, he was a paradox. On one hand, he was a criminal, a man whose name carried fear like a shadow. On the other, he was the neighborhood's self-proclaimed guardian. He gave money to churches, sponsored Little League teams, and made sure no junkies dealt drugs near schools. He visited the elderly, bought groceries for struggling families, and even hosted community events through intermediaries. But kindness from Whitey Bulger was never free. It was strategic. Every act of generosity bought silence, loyalty, or debt. And those who crossed him paid in blood. Whitey's reputation for ruthlessness became the stuff of legend. There were no outbursts, no shouting, no warning shots. When he decided someone had to go, it was done quickly, efficiently, and often without a trace. Bodies disappeared in construction sites, cars, or basements across Boston. Friends became informants, informants became corpses, and the fear that followed became his greatest weapon. His alliance with the FBI deepened. Connolly, whose admiration for Bulger had long since blurred into allegiance, began to treat him as a partner rather than a source. He fed Whitey inside information: who was being investigated, what wiretaps were active, even which agents to avoid. Connolly's reports to his superiors painted Bulger as an invaluable asset. Without him, he'd say, we'd never have crippled the mafia in New England. The FBI bought it. They didn't see the manipulation beneath the cooperation. In reality, the Italians weren't being dismantled by law enforcement. They were being dismantled by Whitey. When the Patriarca family lost key figures to federal indictments, Bulger's businesses filled the void. He muscled in on their bookmakers, seized their loans, and pushed his influence beyond South Boston, into Somerville, Quincy, and even downtown. For the first time in history, The Irish mob was outpacing the Italian one. And it wasn't luck, it was design. Whitey's empire wasn't about chaos. It was about control. Every threat, every bribe, every death served a purpose. He treated fear like currency and loyalty like insurance. Still, not everyone was blind to what was happening. Inside the Boston Police Department, whispers circulated. Detectives noticed that every time they got close to Bulger, the case would suddenly fall apart. Warrants were delayed, raids misdirected, informants vanished. Something, or someone, was protecting him. But without evidence, there was nothing they could do. Whitey had insulated himself so completely that even suspicion couldn't touch him. He lived modestly, an apartment in South Boston with Catherine Gregg, the woman who would later follow him into exile. He drove average cars, wore plain clothes, and blended into the crowd. To the casual observer, he looked like any other aging Southern man. But behind that facade was a mind orchestrating one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in American history. He was no longer a gangster. He was an institution. By the close of the 1970s, Bulger's world stood on the edge of something even larger. The drug trade was exploding, cocaine was flooding the streets, and young dealers were making fortunes overnight. To Whitey, drugs were dangerous business, too public, too unpredictable. But the profits were impossible to ignore. At first, he resisted, forbidding his men from dealing hard drugs in South Boston. But eventually, as the money multiplied, he allowed it quietly, so long as he got a cut. The hypocrisy didn't bother him. In his mind, he wasn't a drug dealer. He was a regulator, keeping the business controlled. That rationalization would later come back to haunt him. But for now, Whitey Bulger was untouchable. The FBI protected him, his rivals feared him, and his neighborhood adored him. He had outplayed everyone, the mafia, the police, even the system itself. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something darker was beginning to stir. The more power he gained, the more paranoid he became. He started to believe that everyone, friends, allies, even Connolly, could one day turn against him. By 1980, the skyline of Boston was changing, glass towers rising over old brick, the sound of construction echoing through streets that once belonged to dockworkers and drunks. But in South Boston, the change was quieter, more dangerous. Beneath the hum of the city, one man had turned an entire neighborhood into his kingdom. His name was whispered, not spoken. His shadow touched every bar, every bookie, every dollar that moved through the streets. Whitey Bulger was no longer just the boss of Southie, he was its godfather. The Winter Hill Gang, now fully under his control, ran its empire like a machine. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion kept money flowing like a tide. But a new tide was coming, one that would change the city and eventually destroy everything Bulger had built. That tide was cocaine. The 1980s brought a flood of it. What began as quiet street-level dealing turned into a citywide epidemic. Everyone wanted in. The money was faster, the profits obscene. Bulger had always told his men to avoid drugs. He saw them as messy, unpredictable, and a guaranteed path to attention from the feds. But he also understood power. And in South Boston, power now meant controlling the drug trade. So, Whitey changed his strategy. He didn't sell drugs directly, he taxed them. Anyone dealing in Southie paid him a rent. Those who didn't comply vanished. The rule was simple, you could deal, but only with his permission. His logic was cold but consistent. If drugs were going to poison his neighborhood, he'd at least control the poison. The violence that followed was swift and merciless. Dealers who refused to pay were beaten, tortured, or executed. Those who cooperated were protected. And soon, South Boston became one of the few places in America where the drug trade operated under a single authority. Whitey called it balance. Everyone else called it fear. By now, he had assembled a tight circle of enforcers, men loyal, brutal, and utterly dependent on him. At the center of that circle was Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy, a man as cunning as he was dangerous. Flemmy had been in the game longer than anyone, with ties to the Patriarcha Mafia and the FBI. He and Bulger were cut from the same cloth, calculating, intelligent, ruthless. Their partnership was perfect and poisonous. Flemmy shared Bulger's belief and control through intimidation. Together, they built a web that stretched across Boston, Somerville, and Quincy. They extorted businessmen, infiltrated unions, and skimmed profits from every illegal operation in the city. They also shared a secret. Both were FBI informants. Their handler, Agent John Connolly, continued to shield them from scrutiny, feeding them inside information and warning of any pending investigations. Connolly's loyalty to Whitey had gone beyond professionalism. It was personal. He saw Bulger not as a criminal, but as a Southie legend. A man who'd beaten the system that had always looked down on them. But that loyalty came at a cost. Every warning from Connolly meant someone else had to be silenced. Whitey couldn't afford loose ends, not with the FBI's eyes occasionally drifting too close. So when a man talked too much, or a name appeared on a potential witness list, Bulger made sure the problem was handled, permanently. In the winter of 1981, one of those problems was Brian Halloran, a young associate who'd started bragging about his connections to Bulger. Word reached Whitey that Halloran was talking to the FBI about a murder, a killing Bulger and Flemmy were tied to. Whitey didn't hesitate. He lured Halloran into a trap, inviting him to meet near the waterfront. When Halloran arrived, gunmen opened fire. The hail of bullets tore through the car, killing Halloran instantly and wounding another man, an innocent bystander named Michael Donahue, who'd only offered Halloran a ride home. 2 men dead, dozens of witnesses, but no arrests. The message was clear: talk, and you die. The murder shocked Boston, not just for its brutality, but for its boldness. It was daylight, in public, with witnesses everywhere. But the case went nowhere. The FBI ignored leads that pointed directly at Bulger. Connolly made sure of it. Behind closed doors, Bulger's paranoia deepened. He began recording conversations, testing loyalties, and isolating himself even from his closest men. He no longer trusted anyone completely, not even Flemmy. The violence didn't stop. Over the next few years, at least half a dozen people connected to Bulger's empire disappeared. Some were traitors, others merely suspected of being traitors. Whitey's rule was absolute: better to kill 10 men you only suspect than to leave one alive who might betray you. Bodies turned up in shallow graves or never at all. One of the most chilling examples came in 1983, when a drug dealer named Deborah Hussey, Flemmy's own stepdaughter, began causing problems. She was using heavily, talking too much, and drawing attention to their operations. Whitey and Flemmy decided she was a liability. According to later testimony, they lured her into a South Boston house under the pretense of a meeting. There, Whitey strangled her while Flemmy held her down. They buried her in the basement of a home owned by a gang associate. Her body wouldn't be found for nearly 2 decades. This was the world Bulger had built, where silence was enforced with death and fear replaced loyalty. Still, to the outside world, Whitey was almost invisible. He lived modestly, rarely flaunted wealth, and avoided publicity. His power didn't come from luxury, it came from control. He walked the streets of South Boston like a ghost, always calm, always watching. People greeted him with a mix of respect and terror. To some, he was a protector, to others, a nightmare. But everyone knew one thing: if Whitey Bulger wanted something, you gave it to him. His relationships extended beyond criminals. He had judges, politicians, and police officers who owed him favors or feared his reach. He attended community events, spoke kindly to old women, and quietly handed cash to struggling families. It was the performance of a lifetime, the benevolent outlaw who loved his people while ruling them with an iron fist. Meanwhile, Connolly and his FBI colleagues celebrated their success in dismantling the Patriarca family. They took credit for the mafia's collapse, never realizing, or never admitting, that they'd only cleared the way for a far deadlier empire to rise. Bulger and Flemmy's information had crippled the Italians, leaving the Irish mob as the last power standing. The Bureau called it progress. Whitey called it victory. But with victory came paranoia. He knew power never lasted forever. The same federal agencies that protected him could turn on him with a change of leadership or policy. So he prepared for the inevitable. He stashed cash, buried weapons, and built escape routes. He also began collecting secrets. Whitey made it his business to know who was sleeping with whom, who was taking bribes, and who could be compromised. He gathered files, real, physical folders, on police officers, politicians, and even federal agents. Information was insurance, and he had plenty of it. By 1985, Whitey Bulger's control over South Boston was total. The Winter Hill Gang operated with precision, the FBI shielded him from prosecution, and his enemies lay buried beneath the city's foundations. Yet behind the power, there was something else, a growing darkness. He no longer slept through the night. He stopped trusting almost everyone, even those who'd proven loyal for years. Every sound in the dark, every whisper in a bar, every unreturned phone call, it all gnawed at him. For all his power, Whitey remained the boy from Southie, raised in violence, always expecting betrayal. At night, he'd stand by the harbor, the cold air stinging his face, watching the lights of the city shimmer across the water. He'd survived poverty, prison, Alcatraz, and wars between gangs and governments. He'd become more powerful than any cop, more feared than any mafia boss. But even then, he knew something was coming. He could feel it, an unease buried beneath the success. Whitey Bulger had spent decades climbing to the top of Boston's criminal underworld. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. And as the 1980s marched forward, the man who had outsmarted the mafia, manipulated the FBI, and ruled Southie with blood and fear was about to face his most dangerous enemy yet, time. The empire he'd built was beginning to crack, not from outside attacks, but from within. The next blood he spilled would not be to gain power. It would be to keep it. By the mid-1980s, the empire that Whitey Bulger had built in South Boston stood at its peak, sprawling, lucrative, and absolutely terrifying. The Winter Hill Gang operated like a shadow government. Every illegal dollar earned in Southie passed through Bulger's invisible hands. He was feared by criminals, protected by the FBI, and admired by those who still believed the myth that he was some kind of Robin Hood, a man who only hurt the bad guys and looked out for the neighborhood. But even myths begin to crack. By 1985, Whitey was in his 50s. His power was undeniable, but so were the pressures. Cocaine had flooded Boston despite his so-called rules, and violence was no longer confined to quiet basements and back rooms. It spilled into the streets, loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore. The FBI's priorities were shifting, the old loyalties inside the bureau beginning to splinter. And within the Winter Hill Gang itself, whispers were growing, whispers of fear, betrayal, and greed. Whitey Bulger could feel the ground moving beneath him. The first real crack appeared in the form of John McIntyre, a small-time smuggler who'd gotten tangled in one of Bulger's side ventures. In the mid-1980s, Bulger and his inner circle had dipped into a new racket, gun running. They were secretly supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army, IRA, shipping crates of arms across the Atlantic. To Whitey, it wasn't just business. It was personal. His parents had come from Ireland. He grew up on stories of rebellion and resistance. Helping the IRA was a way to tie his criminal power to a cause that felt bigger than himself. But it was also risky. McIntyre was part of one of those smuggling operations. When a shipment went wrong, a boat seized, arrests made, Bulger started asking questions. He didn't like what he heard. McIntyre, it seemed, might have been talking to federal authorities. In Bulger's world, talking was a death sentence. Whitey and his right-hand man, Stephen Flemmi, decided to make an example. McIntyre was invited to a house in South Boston under the guise of a meeting. Inside, he found Bulger, Flemmi, and a few other trusted enforcers. At first, it was calm, questions, accusations, denials. But the air was charged. McIntyre knew he wasn't walking out. Whitey stood there, quiet, emotionless, listening to the man plead for his life. Then he nodded to Flemmi. They tied McIntyre to a chair. The interrogation turned brutal. He was beaten, forced to admit what they already suspected, that he'd been cooperating with law enforcement. Once Whitey heard enough, he wrapped his hands around McIntyre's throat and strangled him. They buried his body in a shallow grave under a Southie basement, just as they had with others who crossed them. For decades, McIntyre would remain missing. His remains wouldn't be unearthed until 2000. Whitey's violence had always been strategic. But by now, it had turned compulsive. He trusted fewer people. He double-checked every meeting, recorded his conversations, and even tested his crew with small lies to see who would repeat them. Inside the gang, fear was the currency. Everyone knew one wrong word could mean death. But it wasn't just his crew who lived in fear. The FBI's relationship with Bulger was starting to fracture too. Agent John Connolly, Bulger's longtime handler, was under growing scrutiny. Other agents began to notice how informants in Boston's Irish community kept disappearing, or ending up dead. Each time, it seemed Bulger had somehow known the Bureau's movements in advance. Connolly deflected suspicion with charm and paperwork, but inside the FBI, doubts were spreading. Meanwhile, the Bureau's focus was shifting nationwide. The Mafia, once the agency's biggest target, was losing its grip. With the Italian families collapsing, new investigative energy was turning toward other organized crime networks, including the Irish mob. Whitey could sense the change. His once loyal friends in law enforcement were aging out or moving up. New faces, new ethics, new rules. They didn't owe him anything. The walls, for the first time, were closing in. At home in South Boston, Bulger kept up appearances. He'd still stroll into Triple O's lounge, the gang's unofficial headquarters, order a drink, and talk politics with locals. People still nodded respectfully, still stepped aside when he passed. But behind the charm was a constant edge of paranoia. He no longer trusted phones. He used coded messages and face-to-face conversations only. He rotated cars weekly, often checking under the chassis for hidden transmitters. He demanded absolute silence about his movements. Even his relationship with Catherine Gregg, the woman who would later go on the run with him, became part of this ritualized secrecy. They met in quiet places, spoke in whispers, and lived as though someone was always listening. And someone was. By the late 1980s, local law enforcement had started piecing together fragments of evidence, enough to know that Bulger's reach extended far beyond what the FBI had ever reported. A joint task force between the Massachusetts State Police and the DA began investigating his drug operations and financial networks. But every time they got close, the trail went cold. Informants disappeared. Warrants were tipped off. Surveillance was compromised. It was as though someone inside the system was protecting him, and of course someone was. Connolly was still leaking information, still treating Bulger like an untouchable ally. But it was getting harder to hide. Other agents noticed his suspicious behavior, the unlogged meetings, the off-book communications, the sudden disappearances of key witnesses. Bulger, meanwhile, began to view Connolly less as a friend and more as a liability. He liked having the FBI in his pocket, but he didn't like relying on anyone. If the Bureau turned on Connolly, how long would it take before they turned on him too? By 1988, Boston was a different city. The economy was booming, skyscrapers rising, the working-class edges of Southie softening. But beneath the surface, the old rot remained. Bulger's men still ruled the bookies, the bars, the drug corners. Yet the unity that had once defined the Winter Hill Gang was fracturing. Younger men were coming in, reckless, greedy, and unfamiliar with the unspoken rules of loyalty that had once held everything together. They didn't fear Bulger the same way the old guard did. Some were careless, bragging about connections, flashing money, drawing attention. Others were growing tired of Whitey's paranoia and control. They started questioning whether the old man had lost his touch. And Whitey heard every whisper. Two of his men, John Callahan and Roger Wheeler, were suspected of plotting against him in a money laundering scheme tied to Florida. Bulger didn't wait to find out if it was true. Callahan was shot in the head in a Miami parking lot. Wheeler, a wealthy businessman, was killed outside a country club in Tulsa. The message was clear: distance yourself from Bulger, and you die. By the late 1980s, the violence was catching up with him. There were too many bodies, too many investigations, too many agencies digging into cases that all somehow led back to South Boston. And somewhere inside the bureau, the first real cracks appeared. A few persistent agents began to compare notes. They noticed a pattern. Each time an investigation into Bulger's operations gained traction, something leaked. A suspect disappeared, a meeting changed location, or a case stalled inexplicably. When they traced the leaks, one name came up again and again: John Connolly. It wasn't enough for an indictment yet, but it was enough for suspicion. The FBI's legendary shield of protection around Whitey Bulger was beginning to corrode. And Bulger knew it. He started preparing escape plans. He'd stash cash in secret hideouts, bury weapons in secluded areas, and rehearse getaway routes out of Boston. He even joked with his men, though no one laughed, that one day, if things got bad, he'd disappear and no one would ever find him. It wasn't just a threat. It was a prophecy. By 1990, the empire was still standing, but its foundations were rotting. Whitey Bulger ruled South Boston with an iron hand, but every victory felt smaller, every night longer. The violence he'd used to control his world was now controlling him. The alliances that had made him untouchable were fading. He had spent a lifetime outsmarting the law, and now the law was beginning to adapt. What Whitey couldn't see, or perhaps refused to see, was that the same organization that had protected him for decades, the FBI, was beginning to turn its gaze inward. The day was coming when John Connolly's loyalty would no longer save him. The day was coming when the walls would finally close in. And for the first time in years, Whitey Bulger, the man who had feared nothing and no one, would have reason to be afraid. By 1990, the empire that Whitey Bulger had spent decades building was beginning to rot from the inside. The South Boston streets that once whispered his name in reverence now carried the sound of something different: suspicion. The same fear that had kept people silent for years was starting to shift, turning inward, infecting his own men. For years, Whitey had been the master of manipulation, the ghost who outsmarted both the law and his enemies. But power, like pressure, can only build for so long before it starts to burst. The cracks were showing, in his alliances, in his organization, and most dangerously, in the FBI itself. He had ruled Southie like a king, and like every king, he had enemies waiting for the crown to slip. The trouble began with the FBI's own house of cards. For nearly 2 decades, Whitey's secret alliance with Agent John Connolly had kept him untouchable. Whenever state police, DA, or rival gangs got close, Connolly would quietly tip him off. The arrangement worked because everyone benefited. Connolly rose through the ranks, claiming Bulger as his top informant. And Whitey eliminated the mafia competition, which made the Bureau look good. But by the early 1990s, the Bureau's focus was changing. Younger agents, the kind who didn't grow up in South Boston, didn't revere neighborhood legends, and didn't owe loyalty to old deals, began to question the arrangement. Why did every investigation into Bulger end in dead witnesses, vanished suspects, and mysterious leaks? Why did a man known for murder and extortion never spend a day in court? An investigation quietly began, not into Bulger himself, but into his FBI protectors. And once the first thread was pulled, everything started to unravel. At the same time, Whitey's world was changing in ways he couldn't control. The drug trade he'd once kept, disciplined, was now a wildfire. Cocaine had devoured South Boston, and young dealers, kids who didn't remember the old codes, were cutting into his profits and ignoring his authority. The loyalty that had once bound the Winter Hill Gang was fading. The old guard was tired, paranoid, and too deep in blood to see straight. Whitey was growing older too. His hair had gone gray, his temper shorter. He was still deadly, still cunning, but he was losing patience, and that made him dangerous even to his own men. When he suspected betrayal, he no longer investigated, he acted. In 1990, one of those suspicions landed on Deborah Hussey, the young woman who'd been close to Flemmy for years. She was also the daughter of Flemmy's longtime girlfriend, which made this situation complicated and volatile. Halsey had been spiraling, using drugs, talking too much, drawing attention to herself. Whitey decided she was a liability. He lured her to a South Boston home under the pretense of a talk. Flemmy was there too. What followed was as cold as it was personal. Whitey strangled her, while Flemmy watched. Her body, like so many others, was buried in a makeshift grave beneath a house in South Boston. For years, her name would simply vanish from conversation, another ghost in Bulger's kingdom. Even as he tightened his control, Whitey's paranoia deepened. He'd begun collecting more insurance, documents, tapes, and files about people in power, cops, politicians, judges. He knew things that could ruin lives. Secrets had always been his currency, and now he was stockpiling them like weapons. He bragged to a few trusted associates. "I've got enough on them to make them choke." But for the first time, it wasn't clear if he believed his own invincibility anymore. He was watching the world change, and realizing he might not belong in it. Meanwhile, federal investigators were tightening their net. A new generation of FBI and DA agents, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Wishack, began to take a closer look at the strange immunity that Bulger and Flemmy enjoyed. They noticed something unusual. Every time law enforcement targeted Bulger, their plans collapsed. Files went missing. Suspects were warned. Wishack and his team suspected corruption inside the Bureau itself. They began quietly investigating Connolly and his supervisor, John Morris, who also had ties to Bulger's world. It wasn't long before Morris cracked. Faced with the threat of exposure, he admitted that both he and Connolly had been taking bribes, gifts of cash, wine, and vacations, from Bulger and Flemmy. It was the first real breach in the shield that had protected Whitey for so long. For years, he had paid the FBI for protection. Now that protection was bleeding away. In South Boston, things were falling apart in more immediate ways. The Winter Hill Gang was beginning to eat itself alive. Some members were in prison, others were flipping, and a few had started talking to state police. Among them was Kevin Weeks, Whitey's trusted lieutenant. Weeks had been with him for years, loyal to the core, but even Weeks could feel the shift. The old man was growing unpredictable, violent in ways that didn't make sense anymore. Whitey's decisions were less about power now, and more about paranoia. He began seeing betrayal everywhere. He stopped trusting his own crew, stopped showing up at his regular hangouts, stopped sleeping in the same place twice. To the outside world, he still seemed untouchable. But inside, the empire was collapsing under the weight of its own fear. Then came the murder of Roger Wheeler, a wealthy businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Years earlier, Bulger and Flemmy had invested in a Jai front-end operation, a sports betting enterprise in Florida. When Wheeler discovered they were skimming profits, he threatened to expose them. That threat didn't last long. In 1981, Wheeler was shot dead in his car. For years, the murder remained unsolved. But in the early 1990s, investigators in Oklahoma began re-examining the case, and their leads pointed to one man, John Martorano, one of Bulger's old enforcers. Martorano had been hiding for years, but when he was finally cornered, he made a decision that would change everything. He talked. Martorano began confessing, to murders, to extortion, to the entire bloody history of the Winter Hill Gang. He named names, and at the top of the list were Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmy. The dominoes were falling. By 1994, the FBI could no longer deny what was happening. Their own agents were under investigation for corruption, their prized informants were exposed as murderers, and the entire Boston field office was under national scrutiny. Connolly was desperate. He knew that once the Bureau's protection collapsed, Bulger would be next, and anyone associated with him would go down too. So he made one final call. In December of 1994, Connolly tipped off Bulger that a federal indictment was coming, one that named him, Flemmy, and several others in a massive racketeering case. It was the end of the line. Whitey didn't hesitate. He packed a small bag, grabbed stacks of cash, and disappeared into the cold Boston night with Catherine Gregg by his side. When federal agents arrived at his condo days later, they found everything still in place. The television on, a few dishes in the sink, clothes folded neatly in drawers. It was as if he'd just stepped out for a walk. But Whitey Bulger was gone. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. His photo appeared on wanted posters, in newspapers, and on television. But for years, there was nothing, no sightings, no clues, no arrests. It was as though the ghost of South Boston had vanished back into the shadows that created him. Back home, the empire he'd built crumbled. Flemmi was arrested in 1995. Connolly was indicted soon after. The web that had protected Whitey for 20 years was gone, exposed, humiliated, dismantled in courtrooms and headlines. The city of Boston, once under his iron grip, moved on. The old bars closed, the dockyards quieted, and a new generation grew up not knowing the name that once terrified an entire neighborhood. But for those who remembered, the legend remained, the myth of the man who ruled Southie, the gangster who made the FBI his personal shield, and then vanished before the reckoning came. As 1994 turned to 1995, Whitey Bulger became what he had always wanted to be, untouchable, unseen, and unforgettable. But even as he fled into the shadows, the past was catching up. He had escaped justice, for now. What he couldn't escape were the ghosts he'd left behind, the bodies buried in basements, the families broken, the lives destroyed. And somewhere out there, the most wanted man in America was learning that running from the law was easy. Running from time was not. When James, Whitey, Bulger vanished from Boston in December 1994, it was as if the earth itself swallowed him whole. For more than 2 decades, he'd ruled South Boston with fear, loyalty, and blood. But now, he was gone. No trace, no message, no body left behind. One day, he was the most feared man in Massachusetts. The next, he was a ghost. For law enforcement, it was humiliating. The FBI had been building a massive case: racketeering, extortion, murder, and just as the indictments were ready to drop, their most wanted man simply evaporated. They didn't know it yet, but their own agent, John Connolly, had tipped him off. Whitey had been given a head start of several days, time enough for a man who'd been preparing to disappear for years. And so began one of the longest, most expensive manhunts in American history. Whitey Bulger had always been meticulous. For years, he'd rehearsed his escape plan like a ritual. He kept cash stashed in safe houses across the country, fake identification in hidden compartments, and access to weapons if he ever needed them. He knew how to vanish, how to live small, quiet, and invisible. The first stop was New York. Whitey and his longtime partner, Catherine Gregg, slipped into the city under assumed names. They stayed only a few days, moving through hotels and cheap apartments, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a trace. From there, they went west, across Pennsylvania, through the Midwest, eventually making their way toward the California coast. By the time the FBI realized he was gone, he was already thousands of miles away. For the next 16 years, James, Whitey, Bulger became one of America's most enduring ghosts, a man who had built his life on violence, now living quietly among ordinary people who had no idea they were brushing shoulders with a killer. His face was everywhere, on America's Most Wanted, in post offices, on FBI billboards. The Bureau offered a $2 million reward, the second highest bounty in the nation at the time, just behind Osama bin Laden. But the years went by with nothing. Rumors circulated, sightings in London, in Mexico, in Ireland. Some said he died, others swore he was living under an alias in Europe. Each tip ended the same way: nowhere. What no one knew was that Whitey Bulger had quietly settled into a 2-bedroom rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California, under the names Charles and Carol Gasco. He was hiding in plain sight. To the neighbors, Charles and Carol were the definition of normal. They were polite, quiet, and kept to themselves. He said he was a retired building inspector. She claimed to be a dental hygienist. They took long walks, shopped for groceries at the local store, and doted on a stray cat they'd adopted. Whitey even grew a thick white beard, wore glasses, and dressed like any other aging retiree. He paid rent on time and never caused trouble. When the maintenance man came by, Whitey would chat about sports or politics, always friendly, always reserved. He had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. But beneath the calm surface, the paranoia remained. Inside the apartment, he kept dozens of weapons hidden in secret compartments: handguns, shotguns, even rifles, wrapped in towels and tucked behind walls. More than $800,000 in cash was hidden throughout the unit, some buried in the walls, some in envelopes under the bed. He never trusted anyone, not really. Every morning, he would glance out the window, scanning the street before stepping outside. He carried binoculars and listened for the sound of police radios. If a car parked too long near the building, he'd make note of the license plate. To the world, he was a kind old man feeding pigeons. To himself, he was still the king of Southie, waiting for the knock that never came. The FBI, meanwhile, was facing increasing embarrassment. Years passed, and every lead turned cold. Internal scandals erupted. Connolly was convicted of obstruction of justice and racketeering, later linked directly to Bulger's protection. Flemmy, Whitey's longtime partner, was serving life in prison, having finally admitted to murders they'd both committed. But Bulger was still gone. Agents retired, new ones took over, and the case grew stale. Some believed he'd fled the country permanently. Others thought he was long dead, buried under an alias somewhere far from Boston. But one agent, Anna Bjornsdottir, a former Miss Iceland who had lived in California and once known Catherine Gregg, unknowingly held the key. In 2011, the FBI decided to change its strategy. They'd spent years focusing on Whitey. Now, they shifted their attention to Catherine. The Bureau produced a new series of public service announcements, not about Bulger himself, but about Gregg, her habits, her lifestyle, her routines. They targeted daytime TV audiences, people who might notice her at a doctor's office, a salon, or a pet clinic. And it worked. One afternoon in June 2011, a woman in Santa Monica, later identified as Bjornsdottir, recognized the couple on the screen. She'd seen them before. She called the FBI. Within days, a surveillance team arrived at Princess Eugenia Apartments on 3rd Street. Agents watched quietly as the white-haired man they'd hunted for nearly 2 decades walked to the mailbox, fed a cat, and strolled back upstairs. The resemblance was uncanny. The agents were cautious. After all, the man inside that apartment had a reputation for violence, and rumors said he was armed to the teeth. They decided to act. On June 22, 2011, undercover agents approached Bulger in the parking garage. One asked him to step aside. Whitey turned calm and collected, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but no panic. When asked his name, he said simply, "James." The game was over. Inside the apartment, agents found cash stacked in boxes, 30 guns, and ammunition hidden in walls. Each dollar had been wrapped meticulously in plastic, labeled, and stored like a museum exhibit of paranoia. Catherine Gregg was arrested alongside him. After 16 years, the most wanted man in Boston, the man who had once controlled the city through fear and corruption, was led away in handcuffs. But what struck the agents most wasn't the capture. It was his composure. Whitey didn't resist. He didn't curse or plead. He looked almost amused. When asked why he never tried to flee again after settling in California, he shrugged. "Where would I go?" For a man who had spent a lifetime running, the chase had finally ended, not with a gunfight or betrayal, but with quiet inevitability. Back in Boston, the news broke like a thunderclap. The people of Southie, who had spent years living under his shadow, woke up to see the old man they once called a legend, his face lined in gray, splashed across the television. For some, it was satisfaction, the monster had been found. For others, it was disbelief, their ghost, their myth, had finally been made mortal. Families of his victims wept, not with relief, but with rage. 16 years he'd been free while they buried sons, brothers, and fathers. For the FBI, it was a reckoning, 2 decades of embarrassment undone by a single tip from a woman watching television. In the weeks that followed, the myth unraveled. Agents transported him back to Boston, where crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the old gangster, still sharp-eyed despite his age, stared at the chaos with quiet contempt. He was thinner now, stooped with age, but his gaze still carried that same cold defiance. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors listed his crimes: 19 murders, extortion, money laundering, weapons charges, racketeering. Whitey listened, unmoved. When asked if he wanted to speak, he declined. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was the same weapon he'd always used: power through control. As the trial loomed, Boston held its breath. For decades, Whitey Bulger had been both villain and folk hero, a contradiction stitched into the city's identity. His arrest forced Boston to confront the truth: he hadn't been a protector of Southie. He'd been its executioner. But even now, sitting in a jail cell, he never admitted guilt. He never gave names, never offered remorse. To him, it was all just another game, one he'd played longer than anyone else. For 16 years, he'd lived in the open, unrecognized, unbothered. He'd beaten the system, outlived his enemies, and stayed free far longer than anyone had predicted. In his mind, that was victory enough. As 2011 came to an end, the legend of Whitey Bulger had transformed again. No longer a ghost, no longer untouchable, he was now the symbol of an entire era of corruption, a man who had outsmarted the law, not through genius, but through the rot that lived inside the system meant to stop him. He'd spent decades feeding off that rot. Now, he was about. When James, Whitey Bulger stood in a Boston courtroom in 2013, the air inside felt heavy, decades of fear, grief, and unanswered questions pressing down on the walls. For the first time in history, South Boston's most notorious ghost was flesh and blood again, chained at the wrists, surrounded by marshals. The man who'd once ruled an empire of crime now sat in silence, watching the system he'd corrupted try to reckon with his legacy. For nearly 2 years after his 2011 arrest in Santa Monica, Bulger refused to speak publicly. He was 73 years old when he was captured, yet his sharp blue eyes hadn't dulled. In the detention center, he read constantly: biographies, crime novels, old FBI transcripts, and wrote letters to people who reached out, sometimes to fans, sometimes to those who cursed him. To one, he wrote simply, "I'm not the monster they say I am." But the families of his victims disagreed. For them, the trial wasn't just about closure. It was about reclaiming truth from a man who had built his life on lies, blood, and betrayal. When the court proceedings began on June 12, 2013, it was standing room only. Journalists, law students, and South Boston locals packed into the federal courthouse to witness history. The charges were staggering: 32 counts, including racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and involvement in 19 murders spanning more than 2 decades. He faced the possibility of life imprisonment, and for once, there was no escape, no informant to protect him, no agent on the inside. Prosecutors described Bulger as the reign of terror in South Boston, painting him as a cold-blooded killer who used his alliance with corrupt FBI agents to eliminate rivals. The defense, meanwhile, tried to recast him as a criminal, yes, but not a rat, insisting that he was never an informant, that he played the FBI as much as they played him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The entire trial was built on the collapse of the illusion Bulger had spent decades maintaining, the idea that he'd never sold out. Witness after witness came forward, peeling back layers of myth and fear that had surrounded Whitey Bulger since the 1970s. First came Kevin Weeks, his longtime enforcer, the man who'd once been his shadow. Weeks spoke calmly, recounting how he'd helped bury bodies, launder money, and collect debts for Whitey. He described, in brutal detail, how Bulger would interrogate and execute his victims, sometimes shooting them himself, other times ordering others to do it. Then came Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy, Bulger's former right-hand man and perhaps the only person who knew the full extent of his crimes. Flemmy, already serving life sentences, testified with a grim detachment, recounting how they both strangled women they suspected of betrayal, how they plotted hits together, How Bulger had always insisted on control, always the one giving orders, never taking them. Listening to Flemmy speak, Bulger's composure cracked for the first time. He glared across the courtroom, his hands clenched, whispering to his lawyer. When Flemmy called him a coward, Whitey snapped, muttering, "You're a expletive liar." The marshals warned him to be silent. For the families in the gallery, it was both vindication and agony. To hear, after decades, how their loved ones had died, and at whose hands, was almost unbearable. But at last, the truth had faces, names, and voices. Prosecutors presented evidence that stunned even seasoned investigators. They showed photographs of buried victims, dug up from remote lots across Massachusetts. They displayed weapons seized from his Santa Monica apartment, a personal arsenal of handguns and rifles, still oiled and ready, even after 16 years of exile. They played recordings, old FBI documents, and testimonies from former agents who had once been on his payroll. The corruption ran deep, enough to make an entire city question the justice system itself. One name kept surfacing: John Connolly, the former FBI agent who had both enabled and protected Bulger for years. By 2013, Connolly was already in prison, convicted of racketeering and second-degree murder. His downfall was the mirror image of Bulger's rise, both men consumed by greed, loyalty, and pride. As the evidence mounted, Bulger's defense grew thinner. His attorney argued that the FBI's corruption had tainted the entire case, that the government couldn't prosecute Bulger without admitting its own complicity. But the jury wasn't there to redeem the FBI. They were there to judge the man at the center of it all. Throughout the trial, Bulger never testified. He refused to take the stand, claiming that the court was corrupt, the system rigged. On August 12, 2013, after 7 weeks of testimony and over 70 witnesses, the jury returned its verdict. Whitey Bulger was found guilty on 31 of 32 counts, including 11 murders. The courtroom was silent as the four women read the decision, each guilty, echoing like a hammer striking the past. He showed no emotion. No sigh, no tears, no outrage. When the judge asked if he wished to speak, he said only, "Do what you want with me." Outside, families of his victims wept and embraced. Inside, the man who had once controlled an empire sat still, his legend collapsing under the weight of truth. On November 14, 2013, James Whitey Bulger was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years. Judge Denise Casper spoke with measured calm as she addressed him. "Your crimes are unfathomable," she said. "You, sir, are every bit as heinous as the stories about you." For many in Boston, it felt like a chapter closing. But for Bulger, it was just another transformation, from gangster to fugitive, from fugitive to prisoner. He was transferred to USP Coleman II, a high-security federal prison in Florida, where he spent most of his days in isolation. Even behind bars, he kept his habits, reading obsessively, writing long letters, maintaining a strict routine. But old age and prison life began to erode the myth. The once fearsome gangster was now frail, his body failing, his teeth gone, his heart weak. Yet his mind remained sharp, and he still carried that defiant pride, the same pride that had kept him alive for so long. Bulger often wrote to journalists and pen pals, defending his past. He insisted he'd never been an informant, never betrayed his people. "The real rats," he wrote in one letter, "were the ones with badges." But time was closing in. In 2018, after serving just 5 years, the Bureau of Prisons quietly transferred him to USP Hazleton, a notoriously violent federal penitentiary in West Virginia. It was a decision that puzzled many. Whitey was now 89 years old, nearly blind, suffering from heart disease. Hazleton was a prison known for chaos, fights, and murders. Within less than 24 hours of his arrival, he was dead. On October 30th, 2018, guards found Whitey Bulger in his cell, brutally beaten, his face disfigured beyond recognition, his body wrapped in a blanket. He'd been struck with a padlock stuffed inside a sock, a prison weapon as crude as it was deadly. His tongue had been nearly severed. He was pronounced dead at 8:21 a.m. The killers, believed to be inmates with ties to organized crime, had targeted him almost immediately upon arrival. Whether it was revenge for his informant past or simply the notoriety of killing a legend, no one knew for sure. But one thing was clear: the King of Southie had finally met the violence he had spent a lifetime inflicting. When the news broke, reactions were divided. Some saw it as justice, a fitting end for a man who'd caused so much suffering. Others called it a failure, the government's inability to protect even its most infamous prisoner. In South Boston, there were no vigils, no flowers, no mourning. Just silence, and the echo of a ghost who had haunted their streets for half a century. The legend of Whitey Bulger ended not in a blaze of gunfire, but in a filthy cell in West Virginia, beaten to death by men who probably knew his name long before they ever saw his face. In the end, his life became the perfect reflection of the world he built: power earned through betrayal, loyalty paid for with blood, and an empire that turned to dust the moment its foundation cracked. For all his cunning, for all his years on the run, Whitey Bulger couldn't escape the one truth every criminal learns too late: the past always catches up. And when it did, it wasn't the FBI, the courts, or the people of Southie who brought him down. It was the same kind of men he'd once ruled: ruthless, cold, and unafraid. The circle had closed.